Actually, that is sort of fun. The broad range of locations where everybody is.
It is.
Makes things interesting.
Kind of like Space Ghost, Coast to Coast.
Yeah.
Oh, gravy. Who is calling me? This had better be good. Hamilton, Texas. Not today, scammers. Oh, boy.
Getting them a little bit of free airtime, though, huh?
Yeah, well, in the sense that I'll, yeah.
Hello, caller number 3. You're live.
Tell us about your OT security problems.
That actually might have been fun. Not that we don't have a good topic for this one, too. Okay.
Now I said that, I'm thinking, we got to make that happen.
Yeah.
And we got to have, Electrician Bob do, a call-in or something like that.
I'm not interested in selling my house, but could you answer the following question for me?
Oh, man. That would be good. That would be good. Okay. Let me do the intro, and then we'll fire it off here. Welcome back to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into the topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. Got a pretty darn good panel of folks today, so just going left to right across my screen. Natalie Kalinowski is back with us.
Hey, everyone.
Lance Lamont is back as well.
Hello.
And so is Andrew Wintermeyer.
I am indeed.
And last, but certainly not least, Tyler Bergman.
Hey, guys.
And, of course, myself, Ken Kully, still running this show, apparently, or at least producing these episodes, as it happens. So, I think I made this note, I scribbled this one down during the last episode that we did. I want to say it was Natalie's idea. I'm not 100% sure that it was, because I don't have the notes up in front of me. But it was this idea of, I'm 95% sure this was your thought, Natalie. And it concerned something that we were talking about last time, which is, obviously with the Verve solution and with other solutions that are out there, any asset management solution, you're collecting data about your assets. And the question came up of how worried do you have to be about the staleness of that asset data? That might not be the quite the way you worded it, but it was essentially, the question of how current do you need your asset data to be, really? And I don't know, I guess there's probably a couple of different ways to look at that, because on the one hand, it seems like a good idea to, make sure that you're always keeping up to date with what's happening with the assets in your environment. But at the same time, how often do the assets in your environment actually change such that you would need to be refreshing that data on a really regular timetable? And this came out of the same discussion of the network impact of asset management solutions and how often they're reaching out to devices and how much additional traffic load they're putting on the network. It was kind of all wrapped up in that. And that was going to be sort of the initial topic for today. And then some interesting news dropped over the last day or so that kind of lit up everybody's LinkedIn feeds, I'm sure, which was, of course, the issue with MITRE and the CVE framework.
What issue with MITRE and the CVE framework, Ken? What are you talking about?
Well,
I've been underground all day. I woke up, I immediately came down here. I don't look at the internet at all. What's going on?
Okay. So,
everything's fine, right?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Because MITRE, the MITRE Corporation totally did not warn yesterday that the U.S. government funding for the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures and Common Weakness Enumeration, CVE and CWE, respectively, the funding for those programs was totally not set to expire today, Wednesday, the 16th, as we record this. No, that was totally not the case, except that it totally was the case. And this was kind of a big panic button moment for a lot of folks across the cybersecurity industry because the CVE program has really sort of established itself as a critical component of cybersecurity ecosystems around the world. In a rare repudiation of the XKCD comic, it was a case of where everybody got together and actually agreed on a standard, and it became, one of the pretty much the defining standard for identifying and cataloging vulnerability disclosures as they become public, giving each one a unique CVE ID, giving each one of them a common format, ensuring everybody uses the same language when discussing these vulnerabilities. And so for that program to suddenly go poof due to lack of funding, kind of risked a lot of organizational chaos, because if that framework were to collapse, it's not, technically, if the CVE program went away, it's not like security software itself would stop functioning. And it's not like losing the CVE program would suddenly leave every endpoint, every computer, PLC, switch, whatever. They wouldn't suddenly become more vulnerable to cyber attack. But our ability to track and categorize and prioritize actions to mitigate vulnerabilities would certainly be impacted, because even within the Verve software itself, we don't just stop at collecting that asset data. We start there, and we'll connect out to different whether that's controllers and PLCs, switches, OS-based endpoints. We'll collect information from all of those that we will then use to, and I don't know if we want to get into the technical details of the common platform enumerator, the CPE, the CPEs that we create, but essentially we create a very customized query, again, using a standardized format that can then be executed against vulnerability databases, including NVD, including MITRE, and a few other ones that we leverage as well. And those queries are built using the data that we capture from devices, who the vendor is, what OS or firmware it's running, what version of that OS or firmware it's running, and other stuff besides. And based on that data, those query searches may bring us back one or more CVEs that apply to this particular asset. And being able to then present that to the customer then gives them an idea of what vulnerabilities exist in their environment using that lovely common language of CVE, and hopefully informs a strategy, or at least a prioritization, for how they go about mitigating vulnerabilities within their environment to the best of their ability. We all kind of know, and we've said before in OT, that you are never going to really clear 100% of the vulnerabilities that exist in your environment. There's a variety of reasons for that, but it is nice to be able to have a solid understanding of what's out there in your environment, because then you know what you're defending and what you're defending against, and you can build a strategy around that versus, just kind of taking your best guess as to what's out there and not. So anyways, yes. Now I gather that in the intervening few hours between, this announcement and now, CISA stepped in at the last minute. They extended the contract with MITRE for another 11 months. And then I think MITRE is also, I guess there's a bunch of CVE board members now that have announced what they're going to call the CVE Foundation, basically moving the CVE program into a nonprofit organization, ideally to, secure the long-term stability of the CVE framework, and also independence from any one corporation or any one funding source. I guess it would probably be a little too on the nose to, point to the Wikimedia Foundation or something like that. But if you think about how, Wikipedia is essentially open sourced and funded through, this organization, the foundation that regularly solicits donations, sometimes with very large and garish banners, admittedly, something like that. Now,
yeah.
So, anyways, that was the drama of this week, and it kind of, in a bizarre sort of way, these two things kind of meld together because, like I mentioned there in that monologue, we do collect asset data, and it's that asset data and the richness of that asset data that then lets us pivot to looking in very high detail for CVEs that are applicable to an asset and that asset in particular. It's one thing to, take note of the fact that, oh yeah, you got 200 Rockwell devices on the network, and then just dump out a list of all potential Rockwell CVEs. That's going to oversaturate very quickly.
A flood.
A flood, if you will. Yes, a torrent. Versus, being able to. Oh, sorry, Tyler. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of other things that play out there. So, let's go a little bit further out, right? 30,000 foot view. Okay, so it's also been, the National Vulnerability Database. They've had all these CVEs out there for us to be able to do lookup and things of that nature, right? So that's kind of one of the big things. So kind of a little bit more predating of just the current emergency is there's been a lot coming down the pipeline talking about, hey, they've got such a tremendous backlog on CVE enrichment out there, right? So I know that's kind of been predating some of this net new stuff, right?
I think we mentioned that in a previous episode too, but go on.
Right. So I get that. Everybody is always trying to look for funding out there. This is probably one of the net new, and it may have been just kind of the new things that's kind of maybe fallen on his face with the shuffle that's been going on as far as funding and the federal government and things of that nature. So I know a lot of it's just kind of been on the U.S. front as far as funding, and it always has been up to the vendors to be able to provide vendors or kind of quote unquote other parties that would go out there and find these type of typical vulnerabilities and report on them, and then do the different enrichment data on it based on what the applicability is for the ecosystem, right? So and we could probably even go down the path of saying, well, on some of these submissions, are they like very valid security concerns? Because I know one of the forefront on some of the OT side is, and some of them that I see out there, and some of them are questionable, like some of the security stacks that are put up, or some of the networking stacks that are put out there for some of the OT components are very, very, very slim out there. So there's nothing to be unsaid out there where they could go in there and start beating up on some of these older network security stacks and cause like a denial of service on some of these guys, which is fairly common, right? So and it's very common across the board right there. So like the VX Works, I think it was like Urgent 11 or something like that came out with, it was so sweeping because everybody was using the same networking stack out there too. So that is kind of the involvement on the OT side of the world. Well, I also know like the IT side of the world, they utilize it for like all the different equipment out there under the sun out there, all the different networking vendors, firewall vendors, and things of that nature. So it's kind of an all-encompassing, smorgasbord of what is potential vulnerabilities out there for people to be able to play whack-a-mole out there. That kind of what keeps us gainfully employed out there because, we're able to respond to these vulnerabilities and say, hey, we need to patch this out there, or what type of engineering controls out there do we have to help mitigate some of these vulnerabilities that are out there, right? Keeps us actively employed. But on the contra side of that is like, well, who goes to say we have any of these in our environment, right? That's kind of the other biggest aspect when we're talking about asset information or asset management altogether, right? And I think we may have hit this on a prior episode as well. And I know, Lance, we talked about this in great detail before. Like when you're talking about your different cybersecurity frameworks out there, regardless of what it is, CIS or NIST or anything like that, one of the very first steps in it is, hey, what's your asset inventory look like, right?
Absolutely.
So yep. I think, it's all full circle. Trying to get a complete and accurate asset inventory. Some organizations will resort to ping sweeps, using like widely available free IP address scanners out there on the internet, and keeping a table in Microsoft and like some type of a table or something of that nature. But if you're only running that like every 6 months or something like that, are you keeping it accurate and up to date? That could also be debatable. You could throw it into an automatic tool, I might know a couple out there, that could help you with that asset management and keep you up to date on what's going on out there for those assets too, right? So, and that's where we come into play too, is because after we bring you back make, model, and firmware variation that is running on that asset, then you go through the, the task of building that CPE string to build that do the lookups on what could be the vulnerabilities associated with this asset right out here, because that's kind of the other part of the CVE ecosystem out there. And I know, Ken, you alluded to that as far as building the CPE strings, right? And that,
and we don't need to necessarily go into like the nitty gritty, because they're kind of intensely technical.
Yeah. That's one of those arduous tasks that Lance and his team goes out there and does.
Oh, well, we automate that, obviously, from the, make sure our drivers create those correctly. But yes, making sure they link accurately between whichever device from that driver to the correct one is definitely one of the things we put a lot of effort into.
Yeah. The secret sauce type of thing, shall you will, right?
I could tell you, but then we couldn't stream this.
Exactly. So it comes down to, we do some little magic in the background to help you out and tell you, what's pertinent, what's not. Trying to help you filter through all that noise that's out there too, right? So if you get the CISO wakes up in the morning, it's like, hey, I got a new vulnerability out here. What does that impact out here? You might have a good way of being able to filter through that noise and tell them exactly. It's like, well, I've got 3 sites that affects us on, do we need to do a truck roll to do an update out those guys, or do we have remote capabilities of being able to update those guys, right? That's kind of what keeps us gainfully employed out there, right? Not only it just delivering Verve, but, if we are helping managing our customers in a convenient way, we're able to tell them exactly where their impacts are in their ecosystem, right? Or if, say, you don't really need to worry about that vulnerability because we've got so many other mitigating controls down the list, we could probably table that for the next couple of months to, wait for an outage to be able to patch those things, right? So it all kind of comes full circle with your asset management, how it's impacting you, where the device is located, and kind of rolling it in. CVEs play a great thing in it.
Yeah. So bringing a bit of Ken's initial question here, the how often should we be updating that? Tyler, you mentioned a couple of different timeframes here. One of the thoughts I have around this is it really depends on the facts and the information, the data you're getting out of these devices. If we're looking to match against CVEs and looking only at vulnerabilities, we need to be running at roughly the pace of new vulnerability submissions, right? So if the CVE database, or if we're getting new information on it daily, finding out the devices we have vulnerabilities, we don't need to scan any more than once a day, if that's how often we're getting our updates for the vulnerability database. Or we could need it even less if we're only updating our database, where we're only looking for new CVEs every month, then we wouldn't need to scan further. But I don't think that's the only reason that we're doing asset inventory. Obviously, it's a super valuable thing for us, incredibly valuable to be able to identify those vulnerabilities, but there's other reasons, identifying devices that we don't expect on the network. So there's all sorts of different reasons that we could be doing asset inventory. And I think when we get back to this question of how often should we be doing it, it really comes down to why are we doing it? What are we doing? Why are we getting it? When we look at individual devices, some devices we can get incredibly accurate information, but that's also only accurate for that point in time. We can get processor usage, we can get temperatures, we can get what percentage the fan is on, we can get all of these sorts of things, but getting that information and having it become stale, or I should say that information becomes stale in minutes or hours, not days or weeks. But if we're looking at it from the perspective of vulnerabilities, maybe we don't need to scan that often.
Yeah,
very
that's something
true.
that I kept dwelling on when Tyler was talking about like sort of the different things that we would look for on a network. Is it really does sort of bifurcate, because there is absolutely some stuff that you do want to try and capture moment to moment, whether that's your fan speed or even just having that, that very, very regular check of, hey, what is even connected to my network?
Yep.
I'm sure a lot of us, even just on this discussion, more of you out there listening have been in cases where whatever solution you've deployed has actually caught something you didn't expect. Something pops up on the network and you're just like, oh, what is that doing there? I know I've done that many, many times I've seen that with Verve clients, and even in some of my previous jobs, like I can remember running some kind of network analysis and scanning software, and all of a sudden something pops up that I hadn't seen before, and I walk down 2 cubicles and it's like, oh, hey, the PLC vendor's here, and they've just wired their dirty internet-facing laptop directly into my control network to do some PLC programming. And it's like, no, get off. Like,
That never happened.
Never. More than a few hundred too many times. But at the same, so there is definitely stuff where you want to be capturing that moment to moment data, or like fairly regular data, whether because it goes stale very quickly, like, fan speed. I mean, my fan speed now is not my fan speed 5 minutes ago. Or, capturing new assets on the network. But then there's other stuff that, doesn't change that much. Maybe you want to be pulling a switch or something that we can save a configuration off of to watch for configuration changes. But if it's, a less sophisticated device that, we're essentially like getting make, model, firmware, and backplane cards, and that doesn't change even once a year, do you need to be banging away collecting that information on the regular? No. That said, it is good to be regularly looking for new CVEs that drop for something that doesn't change with any particular frequency.
Yeah. Well, you drive into a next topic when you're talking about any of the cybersecurity frameworks out there. So one of the other kind of casual terms that they'll throw out there is change detection, right? And there's a
Right.
number of different devices out there we do change detection for as well, as your OS assets, your networking assets, and things of that nature, going forward. So there's other things that kind of come into play when you're talking about your asset inventory. At a rudimentary level is your asset inventory. But if you start automating that, you start thinking about your next steps in your cybersecurity journey. It's like, well, okay, if I'm getting an automated asset inventory, it's grabbing configuration information for that asset as well, then I can actually roll that into the same system and I can start doing change detection, right? Now I can start getting signals off of these devices based on the intrinsic information I'm pulling from the device itself to say, hey, there was a change on this guy. Was that authorized? Did that go through my tab board? My change management process that I have in place. So those are all kind of other little caveats out there that I think are kind of coming into the OT landscape that, even the IT landscape out there, they're still struggling with some of those landscape changes out there for having a change advisory board or having some type of a change management process out there. So it's just depending on where you are in your state of your cybersecurity journey on what is the impact of those other items out there too, right? Vulnerability is one of them. Change management is one of them. Change detection is a very valid item out there to have within your arsenal for your cybersecurity venture. But it also really goes to shine a light on, where are you at on your expedition out there for your cybersecurity journey, right?
Absolutely. And, coming back to the headline news for it, I mean, change management doesn't play into something like the CVE quite as much. But again, like it's one of those things where you should be capturing changes, because as you make changes, whether that's to device configuration, whether that's to what's the word I'm looking for here? Device configuration, or the firmware, or OS version, or even just patching your Windows endpoints. All of that will then inform the CVEs that your environment has to, worry about, that you will be vulnerable to, right? You apply a Windows patch, now hopefully everybody is patched against CVE 2017-0144 or CVE 2014-0160. And if you're not,
I have to apologize. I don't know what those are. Throwing a number out. Yeah.
Well, I chose them deliberately.
I think one of them
because
was a WannaCry or something like that too.
One of them's Eternal. It's Eternal Blue and Heartbleed.
Yeah.
Right. And for people who are really, really in the know, like you've got that completely. Those numbers will like strike fear into your heart. But if you don't know, then it's just mindless technical gobbledygook, and that's fine. But if you're patching, and it's a good thing to, go from like, oh shoot, that one is on my list of CVEs. I apply patch. Now it has dropped off my list of CVEs. And so it kind of just all blends together, which again was sort of, like I said at the start, it's not that losing MITRE or losing the CVE data, it's not like losing the CVE system would suddenly make everybody vulnerable to Eternal Blue again, but it robs us of that common language for describing those vulnerabilities, especially those headline vulnerabilities. That makes the job of, it doesn't make you more vulnerable to them, but it does make it harder to defend against them when we're not now all able to sort of speak in that same language of what is and isn't a pressing concern in terms of vulnerabilities and whatnot.
Yeah, because it's also been kind of a driver of change out there too, right? So, as vulnerabilities creep up out there, you get those headline ones out there like a WannaCry or a, Eternal Blue out there, where, people are wanting to try to be actively being proactive for their systems, or being defenders, right? Red team, blue team, right? We're defenders. We're trying to defend the ecosystem from any type of malicious or ill content out there. And that gives us kind of a clear indications out there of what we can try to at least protect against. And it just depends on what your strategies are, right? Maybe it is patching against those CVEs, depending on what it's related to, like a hardware device or an OS level device or things of that nature, right? But if we start losing those types of feeds out there, generally what is the impact then, right? So, within the OT landscape, some of the changes out there were more operationally based than what it is related to vulnerabilities, right? But it also makes not the exclusions on the periphery that's, the outside trying to get in, right? Like maybe I have a multi-layered networking system on top of my OT assets that I'm trying to protect there. But if I've got some type of a 0-day on both layers of my firewalls coming in, does that make me more exposed out there? Sure. I would argue to say, yeah, it probably does. So if we don't have any type of indications on that periphery for those items that are trying to protect our, internal gooey candy center that we're trying to protect out there, then that becomes a little bit of an issue out there, right? So I know there's a lot of organizations that try to take that type of an approach where they'll do like a very hard candy shell on the outer of like their OT environment to help protect that, because that typically, and the case for cause, because maybe they don't have that good asset inventory to be able to know what they have out there, right? So it automatically goes to what is the highest order of impact that we can do on this to help protect the entire ecosystem. Well,
right.
Yeah.
Build a nice shell.
Mm-hmm.
It works for a while. It works for a while. Although I don't remember if it was here or on another conversation I was having online, but somewhere I analogized it to a siege. And to be fair, if you are a medieval castle and you are under siege, having a very, very, very thick wall is not a bad thing. It's nice if you have a very thick wall that it takes the besieging army some length of time to breach. But should they breach it, it does help to have people with spears and swords also ready and on hand for the next phase of the problem.
Yep, they're always coming up with additional, more capable siege weapons, right? You see those every day.
Absolutely.
And you could almost equate that to the CVEs, right? These are the more capable, or like we're building a blueprint of the more capable siege weapons that are out there now, right?
Yeah. You see something over the edge of that at that wall, and you never spotted it before, so you try to write it down and say, "Hey, this is something I've seen." So everybody else with your own castles, this is something I've seen. We'll use our standard language to describe it. But suddenly, if it turns into everybody's writing their own pictures and not standardizing that language, it makes it much harder to protect all of the other castles as well.
Right. Which feed do you trust in, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, like oh my gosh! Now I'm trying to remember the name of that, like a barb or something like that, right? My bard. Like, which bard do you trust out there, right?
A town crier or a bard? Yeah.
The town crier.
Exactly.
I love that.
Stand on the corner and yell.
Right? It becomes like a Tower of Babel situation, right? We go from all having one common language to everybody just talking at each other in a variety of things that nobody else understands. Oh, goodness.
The town crier. I see the meme out there with the guy holding up the piece of paper, the siege weapons are coming.
Hear ye, hear ye.
That's awesome.
So this whole scenario did bring up one other sort of key security element that I don't think we've touched on yet. And that is taking a careful look at your infrastructure and your data sources and everything else, and identifying if we have redundancy, and if so, how we could potentially handle the loss of that data source. If the CVE database, not only if they had lost funding, but what happened if the database went offline today? What would we do? How would we be able to handle it? What if that language went away? In the case of our products, obviously, we have an offline version of this that we do a lot of our additional special sauce that, once again, I can't talk about since we're streaming. But what would we do 6 months from now? What would our customers do 6 months from now if that database no longer existed? Where are we getting this additional data? Where are they getting their additional sources of information?
Well, I think that's after the public outcry and doom and gloom and all that good stuff.
Well, we'll just send out more town criers.
Well, and in a way, we kind of do. And again, can't really go into the technical side, but I know, Natalie, this is a question you get a fair bit when you're driving the proof of value, proof of concept work that we do with a lot of potential clients, which is, okay, I see you have this vulnerability detection, but who's your data source? Because there's not just one answer there, right?
Yeah, I think that was something I was actually thinking about, because when we were talking about the backlog of CVEs coming from the National Vulnerability Database, where do you get information if that information isn't up to date in the CVE? And so for us, at least, we look at other sources. So there's obviously CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. There's also Metasploit, which is another database that kind of tells you about known and unknown vulnerabilities. And then, of course, each vendor has their own kind of way where they publish their own security advisories. And so in that case, when you are looking at vulnerabilities, you also kind of want to, one, check your sources, but also it helps to kind of confirm it and double check it. So if you see it in one place, then you want to, you're going to dive into it and see. On the NVD, commonly you'll see the vendor advisory. So once you go to one source, it'll point you to the next one. And so you kind of have to track down where these vulnerabilities are coming from. But it all kind of goes back to, risk prioritization, and risk prioritization starts with that asset inventory. So it's all kind of a looping circle, is that you have to see your devices and then figure out which of your devices you're going to be worried about. And then when you're looking at the actual vulnerabilities, well, obviously there's multiple sources you can be looking at. And then when you're looking at, I guess circling back to the first thing I said with the backlog, I was looking up some articles as you guys have been talking, just to kind of see how bad is that backlog, how far behind are they? And it's actually not awful. I think the biggest problem that like the CVE database is basically facing is that the amount of submissions they're getting every year is increasing. So in 2024, they had a 32% jump in submissions of CVEs. So that might just mean that, people are getting better at reporting it, or like vendors are reporting vulnerabilities more often than maybe they were in the past. Or maybe there's just an uptick in the vulnerabilities that are being identified. But it is kind of interesting to see, like, where's the source? What information are they grabbing? And then how are they relating it back to the devices themselves? So yeah, so you're right. It's a question I get a lot from customers, and when I'm talking to people, when we're doing a proof of value in their environment, to kind of figure out, not just what their devices are, but where are they actually kind of getting all this vulnerability information from.
I mean, I guess, the other disadvantage to, the other disadvantage to losing, the CVE framework as something standardized would be everybody, because that wouldn't stop. But now it's just everybody that gets us back to that Tower of Babel situation, right? Like everybody would kind of revert to having their own record keeping, right? So it wouldn't now just be CVE 2017-0144. It would be we'll think about like it in terms of like Microsoft KB numbers, right? Or everybody would kind of just revert to some sort of in-house system. And that's all well and good. And I mean, you can pull all that in still with, the different feeds that we leverage to build like our vulnerability database, but it does kind of rob, it does kind of still rob some meaning out of it, because, now it's like, instead of just being able to look in a dashboard and see a nicely formatted list of CVEs, now maybe it's going to be, CV, maybe something will still keep using CVE numbers, but then it'll be like an MSKB, blah, 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 and a Rockwell KB, blah, 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 and, on and on and on down. And all of a sudden it becomes a lot less elegant and a lot more of a challenge for the UI people to figure out how to format, as well as for, clients to then sort through and figure out, okay, what am I actually dealing with here? And how do I account for, the severity of all of these different things?
Yeah. And I think, obviously we said that the contract kind of got extended for another 11 months. So we're still going to have CISA, funding the CVE, all those vulnerabilities coming through there. But there's also that whole history aspect. So the CVE program, because I was Googling a ton of information about it, it's been around for about over 25 years, and they have over 274,000 CVEs. So if you just think about the kind of like volume of vulnerabilities that have been reported, but also consider that, the historical vulnerabilities for like legacy devices that we're tracking. So again, it's definitely something that I don't think we'll steer away from that kind of centralized source. I think they'll definitely find a way, kind of like what you were mentioning with that CVE Foundation. But I think diversifying the source of information will definitely help, just to not be so dependent on, one source of data, if you will. But I guess we'll see what happens in the future as they kind of decouple it from like a governmental organization and make it something that, can be, sustainable and more stable for the future.
Absolutely. Well, kind of a heavy topic in a certain sense. But very current events.
On the plus side, we have a little bit of time now, the 11 months. This is good to make sure we're in a great position.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, at some level, we're just going to keep doing what we do and leveraging multiple sources of threat and vulnerability information. I actually wouldn't be surprised if that became much more commonplace, because, kind of like you said too, Natalie, it's a good reminder that as much as we would like maybe to have that single source of truth, that is like the definitive the definitive resource for this kind of information, especially if it's tied to some sort of governmental body or some sort of NGO that is heavily reliant on government funding. Unfortunately, those are things that can turn up as suddenly, shockingly ephemeral, whether that's, because a grant is given for a set period of time, and all of a sudden, whoops, we totally forgot that the expiry date was coming up really, really fast, i.e. tomorrow, or as has been in the news in the US, whether you have an administration come in that is very, very determined to cut programs with not always the most amount of thought as to what those programs are and where the money going to those programs ultimately ends up dispersed to. It's sort of that reminder that's like, okay, yeah, we can't rely, as much as we would like to believe that something like MITRE would be that sole source of truth for the foreseeable future. That's the illusion of permanence as opposed to actual permanence. And we really do need to be able to route around a potential outage should one ever actually occur.
I think of a really good positive response and I try to bring positivity into these things, and
well, I was trying to end on like a positive note. Like there's a call to action there, which is, to say hey, like we shouldn't, we should develop it's a call to resilience, it's like,
there we go.
Develop a way to route around potential damage. It's kind of a networking joke too, but it's neither here nor there.
There you go. It's all going to work out. I flipped ahead a little bit, and it turns out we solved this whole cybersecurity thing in 2027. So it's really cool. I wouldn't worry that much about it.
It's coming up on like
turns out not even really that big of a deal.
I'm expecting the full task list. Yeah.
Yeah, spoiler, I think it's Europe who's going to solve our problems as NIST 2 kind of kicks into gear over there.
Yeah. Oh, hey, who wins the cup in 2027? I have to visit PointsBet.
I can't. Spoilers.
Yeah. Once again, he could say it, but then we couldn't stream it.
Right. Is that first rule of time travel or something like that?
Yeah.
I think overall, we've got we had interesting things happen. It's forcing additional thought and forcing additional emphasis on making sure we're really robust. But when we look internally, we're in a pretty good place. But then as we continue to look forward, we just need to make sure that we keep thinking across the whole spectrum, not just focusing on one individual area.
Yep. First rule of cybersecurity, keep the attackers guessing.
Isn't that also the second rule?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yep. Listen to the town crier.
Nice.
I'm not going to shake that today.
One thing you can shake. So following on from last episode, don't have a question this week, but I do have a result. Because, as you may recall, we put out the vote for which of the two versions of legacy code on the conveyor belt the audience preferred. There were links to both in the show notes, and the poll went up on LinkedIn. And in an absolutely overwhelming landslide victory, 86 to 14%, the hard rock version versus the more acoustic chill version, the hard rock version won out handily. So I'm going to have to make sure to get an up-to-date MP3 of that one from you, Mr. Lance, so that we can release it by whatever means we are able to. And there'll be a download link in the show notes.
Awesome. Hopefully we'll be making a full CD, right? So we'll get half a dozen more tracks.
Man, I can't wait for that to drop.
I'll have my whole second career.
Yeah.
OT specialty rock music, or a wide variety of OT music.
Geek pop culture.
Will you have a single for the holidays?
No,
of course. I'm in the colo when I'd like to be home with my family for Christmas. Right.
Lance, I really thought you were out at Coachella with like spinning some OT beats and all that, you know?
Oh yeah, they don't let me on the main stage though. The lyrics are too geeky.
I'm offline for Christmas. My phone is far away.
I can't find the CVE.
Oh, that's too classic.
I still find myself humming Ping of My Heart in my head sometimes, and I'll be like, where's that song from? Where did I hear it? And then I'll remember, like, oh my God.
Yep. You're the only person that you know that knows that song, except for us strange people you're talking to.
Exactly.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. Well, I think I'm going to say that is it for this month. You've been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Please share our episodes with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octo Sound. Look them up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Tyler, for chiming in today. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.
We solved this whole cybersecurity problem completely in like 2 more years. Just hang in there, guys.
Well, Druid,
Are
it
you
sounds like you were speaking from the future.
Yeah.
Your audio was very bad, but
If I can amplify that section, I'm totally adding like some kind of weird distortion. That's going to be amazing.
I'm not sure if it needs any additional.